It's so different being in a new spot and trying to get used to stuff. So here's some new things that will be happening for me today. I don't normally have slides, but I'll have slides today. So that's going to be fun. The other is obviously the mic. I'm going to work on that and try to do that well. And also just being in a new context. But I'm so happy to be with you. My name's Justin Harris. I'm the pastor at Faith Bible Church, which is literally only one exit up on the corner of Immokalee and Tarpon Bay. And I've been there for 4.5 years now. And it's been a wonderful privilege to advance the gospel here in Naples, right alongside you guys. It seems at about the time the Seacrest landed here, so also we landed here. And it's been nice to see the gospel advance in 2 different locations. We've been in our church preaching through the book of Philippians, and the theme of that book is partnership in the gospel. And one of the things that has impressed me, especially in my study of that, is that we are not the only ones around who are trying to see Christ's name advance. Not around the world, not even in this city. This is something that we do together. And so in conversations with John in recent weeks, we were talking about this very thing, and we thought that this would be a good expression of our partnership in the gospel together to show that the competition is not between churches. The competition is to see Christ's name advance against the darkness. And so I'm glad that he's over preaching to my people this morning, and I'm happy to have the opportunity to be ministering the word to you. So please take your Bible and turn with me to Philippians chapter 1. Philippians chapter 1. And we'll be looking at verses 12 to 18. Philippians 1, verses 12 to 18. And let me read this text for us to begin our time in God's Word today. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. I think we all do well from time to time to heed the inimitable words of Yogi Berra. He said it this way: if you don't know where you're going, you might not get there. If you don't know where you're going, you might not get there. It's not as profound as it seems. What he's speaking to is that desire that we all have to be able to make progress to something that really matters. We typically think through what's most important and how do we get there. And we find success in that. There's some joy and satisfaction in knowing that, we went the right direction. We're making progress toward a certain goal. And so for many of us, when things are going well and when progress is being experienced, we're thinking that things are up. And when we're not meeting our goals, or it seems that the numbers that we've set for ourselves are down, we're not as happy anymore. And because of that tendency to tie our joy to our accomplishment, we need to be careful about what we measure. We need to be careful about the goals that we set. I even read an interesting article in the Harvard Business Review from a few years ago, humorously entitled, "Goals Gone Wild." The whole point of the article was that the goal setting, which has become such a trend in people's personal lives and in business, can actually be a very dangerous enterprise because people have a tendency to measure that which really doesn't matter. I mean, you think of it in this way. People who are measuring things like credit card points earned instead of interest dollars saved. Or you would think of it in terms of someone who counts calories, but is not concerned about weight loss. Just because you're tracking your calorie count doesn't mean that you're making progress in your health goals. Maybe one that hits a little closer to home. Tracking money made instead of family members loved or time spent. It's so easy to measure the wrong things. And this measurement misplacement isn't merely a financial thing or a family thing. It's something that can happen even in the eternal realm as well, in local churches just like this one. We can find ourselves from time to time beginning to measure that which does not really matter. Even in our own spiritual, personal walk with the Lord, we start to set some standards for success that really may not be success. How many times in your own life have you kind of patted yourself on the back for the number of chapters read, or the amount of time prayed, or the amount of offerings given, or the number of meetings attended? We just think, oh, I need a number. I want to measure something. I want to have some progress. I'm not saying any of those things are bad, but are they the best measurement of our spiritual progress? Think about it on a church level, not just you as an individual, but think about your church. What is that defines success for Compass? Well, one of the things that churches like yours and mine have to fight against is that tendency to count nickels and noses. Or I was actually talking to one Southern Baptist pastor this past week who said that they have had to make a correction in what they're measuring in their church because their former standard of success, and pardon the crude language here, was butts, budgets, and buzz around town. Is that really the standard of success? Or can we pat ourselves on the back if things are going well in those three arenas? Even in these days of COVID, it may be the number of views watched or likes clicked. But is that really success? So what we have here in Philippians is a contrast to all of that. Because in a rather indirect yet impactful way, the Apostle Paul is going to show and model for us what really matters in ministry. What really matters. What you need to understand is that as we've made our way to verse 12 here, Paul's been celebrating something, and that is their fellowship or their partnership in the gospel. We typically think of fellowship in terms of like coffee and donuts after church. Paul used the word fellowship in quite a different way. Actually, I think that Tolkien's Fellowship of the Ring is probably a good picture of what Paul meant by the fellowship of the gospel. We're talking about people who have bonded together to accomplish a common goal, and he's celebrating up to this point this partnership that he enjoys with them. He's saying, hey, you know what unites me and you, Philippians? The gospel. You're trying to advance it, I'm trying to advance it, and God has blessed us with this great relationship. So he's already made that clear that that's the goal of their joint venture together. But one of the things that he's going to do here is he's going to use his personal experience to actually warn them against an obstacle that has been introduced to their advance of the gospel. And that little obstacle is themselves. Sometimes it is easy for us to lose sight of what really matters because we think that we may matter most. So Paul's going to cover this in depth in chapter 2, and he's going to say, hey, there's some disunity. Some of you are too worried about yourself. He's going to hit it again in chapter 4. But what he does in chapter 1, verses 12 through 18, is he actually sets up through personal example what he wants them to be. I mean, that's the best teaching, right? They say that things are better caught than taught. So Paul here, in the midst of his distress, in the midst of his problems and circumstances, he's going to say, hey, here's how things are going with me. And through that, he's giving them a little lesson on how things should be going for them. Now, you need to be aware of something historically to really appreciate what's going on here. Paul has not had a good few weeks. It's been a rough time. In fact, he is actually under house arrest writing this very letter. And he is facing potential execution for preaching the gospel. Those aren't very comfortable circumstances. And yet, what he models here is mind-blowing. I mean, where they would see problems for Paul, he sees positives. Where they would express concern, he actually expresses contentment. And that's the whole point. He's telling them, through my life, I want you to note what really matters. So we're going to see this morning 2 lessons on what really matters. 2 lessons regarding what really matters from Paul's example. The first one is simple. The advance of the gospel matters more than our personal convenience. The advance of the gospel matters more than our personal convenience. Look at verse 12 again. Notice this. He says, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. The implication here in this kind of friendly letter that Paul is writing them is that they were concerned about how he was doing. I mean, if you read through the whole letter, you're going to find out they sent this guy Epaphroditus to his prison cell just to check on him because he had a relatively rough year. I mean, if I'm not kidding, I normally would commend reading and be like, it's going to be a challenge. Some of the funnest Bible reading you could do all day today is to go back and read Acts 21 to 28. You will not want to stop. Because what that is a brief rehearsal of what had gone on in Paul's life up to this point. And so at Acts 21 to 28, let me just give you a brief recounting of how bad, at least from our perspective, it would see that things have gone. In those chapters, we've seen several attempts on Paul's life, multiple high-level political trials, a self-provoked incarceration, a life-threatening sea voyage, and most recently, a prolonged house arrest in Rome. And so they're wondering, Paul, how are you? And so now this is his time to begin to say, oh yeah, this is how I'm doing. And what they want to know is, Paul, how are you really? And he's saying, no, I'm really good. This is what I want you to know. The gospel's still advancing. It's all good because the gospel is still advancing. And let's just be clear. I know that you're clear on this, but I want to be crystal clear. What do we mean by the gospel? We are talking about the good news that Jesus has come as God's chosen ruler and rescuer. That is what Paul's gospel was. Jesus was God's chosen ruler, and he was God's chosen rescuer. Sin had messed us up. We were enslaved. It had ruined the world. Jesus came and fixed it through his perfect life, his atoning death, his resurrection. And he's saying, this is great news. And as long as this news is advancing, it is progressing, everything's cool. I like the word advancing, progressing. When you look through the literature of the day, it actually has the idea of military progress, like an army making its way forward through opposition. If I were to modernize the metaphor, it makes me think of a guy trying to run the ball down the field. And he may get absolutely clobbered by the defense, but he is just delighted that they've got a few more yards. What Paul is saying here is that, hey, look, even though I got laid flat in this particular instance, we gained some yardage. Everything's good. It's not personal convenience that he's concerned about. It is the advance of the gospel. But here's the deal. We got to ask a real logical question at this point because you got to think, how is the gospel advancing if the dude's stuck in prison? I mean, I think if any of us were to draw up a gospel business plan, I don't think that step 1, 2, or 3 would be get thrown in prison. I think we would be looking for maximum mobility. And yet Paul is saying that, no, things are fantastic because I'm in prison. He's not saying that the gospel is advancing despite adversity. He is saying that the gospel is advancing because of adversity. There's a big difference between the two. There's 2 things that happen because of the particular hardships that he was in. The first one he lists in verse 13. And if you're taking notes, you could write this down. I don't have it on the slide, but the first benefit of this adversity was increased gospel impact. Increased gospel impact. Look at verse 13. So that it has become known, talking about everything that's happened to me, it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. My imprisonment is for Christ. He's saying that through this adversity, more people have been reached. Actually, some very special people, the imperial guard. In some translations, it puts it as the Praetorian Guard. These were the Roman military elite. I mean, if this were Star Wars, these would be the guys wearing the red. I mean, if you're thinking of like regular like army, like this is special forces. These aren't just the scrubs. These are battle-hardened men. And Paul is saying that the gospel has penetrated and is beginning to spread through the entire Praetorian Guard. How in the world did that happen? Well, under house arrest, Paul would actually be chained to these guys. Sometimes we get this picture like of prison, and preachers like myself can have a tendency to over-dramatize things. Look, when we think of Paul in prison, please don't, in this instance, think of him like rotting away in a hole somewhere. He's actually under house arrest. But he's not free to go wherever he pleases. He literally is probably chained to a Roman guard. And so anytime their shift changes, guess what happens? Well, they're stuck with Paul again. So he gets to receive visitors and all that kind of thing because he is, again, in a house. But guess what? They have to sit there and listen to every one of his conversations. And I can imagine on those moonlit nights when there were no more visitors, Paul would tell his story just like would happen at any other time. They would read his correspondence. They would see his letters. And through that proclaiming of the gospel, whether it was inadvertent or direct or written, these guys were hearing it. Some received it. And then it began to spread like wildfire through the guard. So the Praetorian Guard was reached because of this adversity. And then it says, and the rest. Who are the rest? Well, those are just all the other people who found out that Paul was there and would actually come and want to hear about his message. So he was provided a platform for the gospel through his pain, through the persecution. And what he's saying is this is something worth celebrating. There is increased gospel advance. And what we need to remember in this, friends, is that every adversity that you or I face brings with it its own opportunity for the gospel to advance. Because of the prevalence of health, wealth, gospel, prosperity preaching, and that kind of stuff that we would see on TV, sometimes we're tempted to think that when things are hard, that we actually have diminished capacity for the gospel. And yet what the Bible actually teaches is that when things are hard, we have dynamic opportunity for the gospel. It's not an obstacle. Adversity is actually an opportunity for the gospel to go forward in a unique way. So I would tell you this, do not waste your trials and your suffering and your sickness and your adversity, because that may be the megaphone that God uses to pronounce the message of Jesus more loudly, more clearly than he ever would if things were going great. Remember the passage in 1 Peter? Chapter 3, verses 13 to 16. Again, should have put it on the screen. It didn't. I'm sorry. But listen. Now, who is there to harm you if you're zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled. But in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you're slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. You know what Peter's saying there? There's going to be unique times in your life where you're going to suffer and you're going to demonstrate joy in that, and people are going to ask, what is up with you? Why in the world are you so positive in all of this? And he said, be ready, because now you've got your opportunity to proclaim the timeless joy that can only be found in the truth of Jesus. So Paul's happy. He wants them to be happy because the gospel is advancing. There is increased gospel engagement. Increased gospel advance. But here's the second thing you can write down that happens in adversity. When we're faithfully advancing the gospel in that, there is also increased gospel engagement. There's increased gospel advance. There's also increased gospel engagement. Look at verse 14. What does it say? And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. He's saying, like, hey guys, here's another benefit of me being locked away in a prison right now. Not only are more people being reached, but listen to this, that's growth by addition. Now more people are preaching the gospel. That's growth by multiplication. And that happens too in adversity. He's saying more people are now beginning to preach the word without fear. By that, the word of the gospel. You have to understand that this was not 21st century United States. You can't just preach the gospel wherever you please. This is Rome. It's the first century. And Christianity is not religio licitus. It is not a actual endorsed religion of Rome. Judaism was. They were okay with Judaism. It was under the approved list. But Christianity was not, and you need to think about it in these terms. In fact, in the first century, people were calling Christians atheists. And you're thinking, oh, how would they call them atheists? They were the ones that believe in God. Well, think about this. Who do the Romans believe is God, at least many of them? Caesar. What was the Pledge of Allegiance for Rome? Caesar is Lord. What was the Pledge of Allegiance for the Christian? Christ is Lord. And so a crucified enemy of the Roman state, you're saying that he's Lord? That's atheism. You don't even believe in God. I mean, this would be like a Chinese national showing up to a Chinese sporting event and during the national anthem wearing his Make America Great Again hat on. It would stick out like a sore thumb. And like that's what they were doing. They were proclaiming like right up in everyone's face that no, Caesar's not Lord, Kyrios, Christ is. And that requires some boldness. And the fact that Paul would do this and that he would suffer for it, you know what it did? It actually strengthened the resolve of others around him. And it does the same for you. Billy Graham said it this way. Courage is contagious. When a brave man takes a stand, the spines of others are often stiffened. You know that to be true, don't you? I mean, most of us in this room won't even try a new restaurant without somebody else having tried it first. If it's not even in person, you'd at least look on Yelp. And if there's like no reviews, it's a ghost town. You're not going. Because we're thinking about, well, has somebody else ever done this? It's kind of like the old thing of the guy who jumps in the water first and he says, hey, come on in, the water's fine. You know, that's exactly what Paul's done. He has jumped in the waters of persecution for the sake of the gospel, and what he's telling them is, come on in, the water's fine. And because of this, multiple people were jumping in, and now the gospel was beginning to increase, not just by addition, but by multiplication. Now more and more people, because of his adversity, not despite it, are beginning to preach the gospel, and this is an amazing thing. This has been true throughout church history. You remember the old saying from the church father Tertullian that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. This is a fact. This has been a fact of Christianity for 2,000 years. When things get tough, the gospel goes forward. You know, it is an interesting thing to consider. Fox's Book of Martyrs, that resource that was so popular in England in the 16th century. The original title was this: The Acts and Monuments of These Latter and Perilous Days Touching Matters of the Church. And what it is one long extended account of individual after individual who suffered persecution for the name of Christ. The woodcuttings that you see behind me are taken directly from the book. In England at the time, it was the second most popular book in existence. Number one, the Bible. Number two, Fox's Book of Martyrs. And you're thinking like, oh, it's easy for a book to be a bestseller. It may be easy to be a bestseller in the United States today with Amazon, but in that particular time and culture, people didn't have money to buy books. And so the fact that nearly every Christian family had a copy of a book like this, you'd be thinking, what is up with these people? What kind of sadist would want to read accounts of people who were tortured for their faith? But do you know what the book did? It started a movement in England that would eventually have it labeled as a Christian nation. I understand that it is that no more. But even secular historians point back to Fox's Book of Martyrs and say that it is the second greatest cause for England ever becoming a Christian nation. And what am I saying? Because of the adversity, more and more people began to proclaim the gospel. And so the question that we would need to ask ourselves in this is, what opportunities for gospel advance might God be extending to you even now through your adversity. See, the temptation is going to be to measure whether or not your life's convenient and think, oh, okay, well, everything's cool because everything's going easy. But God's saying, no, don't measure that. What you really need to measure is the gospel going forward in the midst of the trouble and the trial that I'm experiencing at this particular moment? Measure what matters. What opportunities may there be for you in this time? Whether it's physical pain or whether it's economical hardship or whether even it's relational trouble. Friends, I'm even thinking about this political turmoil that we're in. It's just every 4 years this happens. And everybody gets all up in arms as if the worst thing that could happen would be for someone who is not a Christian or at least friendly to Christians to be the next president of the United States. Friends, I hope that we have as much friendliness from the government level as possible toward Christianity, but I want you to know something. Even if the candidate you want to win doesn't win, it may still be great for the gospel. It may make things inconvenient for us, but it may be good for the name of Christ. And we have to hold on to that level of confidence. That is measuring what really matters. There's another lesson that we should be aware of from the Apostle Paul. We saw first that the advance of the gospel matters more than our personal convenience. But the text also shows that the advance of the gospel matters more than our personal prominence. It matters more than our personal prominence. We're measuring the wrong thing if we're measuring our popularity. We're measuring the wrong thing if we're measuring how much people like us or how much we think they like us. Look at verses 15 to 18. I want you to catch the whole context again. I'm not going to divide it up verse by verse. Notice it. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. Actually, pause. I am going to break it up. What's he doing here? Remember the last thing that he said? The last thing he said was, hey, it's all good because the gospel is advancing, not only by addition, but by multiplication. He says more and more are bold to preach the gospel. But now he's going to expand on that group of people who have begun to preach the gospel, and we're going to find out they all weren't friendly. They all weren't friendly. So notice how he says it here. Again, I'll read verse 15. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, some of these people who started preaching the gospel with me, but others from goodwill. Now he's got two categories of people. Verse 16, the latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former, there's your next category, proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached. And in that I rejoice. Yes, and I will rejoice. Do you see what's happening here? He's saying like, all right, guys, I want you to know that it's all good. It's all good because the gospel's going forward. More people are beginning to preach, but there's another problem, though. Because some of those people who are beginning to preach actually aren't that kind. Now, this will blow your mind because you can't imagine, like we can't imagine, like, well, how could somebody preach Christ and not be kind to another person that's preaching Christ? It doesn't even make any sense. I'll try to explain in a second, but I want you to get the overview of this passage. What we've got in these few verses is two categories of people. I would call them the jealous and the generous. The generous makes sense to us. These are those who are preaching Christ of goodwill. You need to understand, it'd be easy for us to forget, Paul didn't start the church in Rome. More than likely, it was started for some converts of Pentecost. And then they traveled back to Rome. There was a high number of Jews who lived there. The word spread. And so actually, probably 10 years before this, Paul would write a letter to the Romans that we have in our Bibles. And he's actually doing that. He's never met them before. He's doing it to garner missionary support so that he can go on to Spain. But the point is, once they read that letter, they know of Paul. And now they're like, oh yeah, well, we know that Paul guy. He was hoping to come, and now he wasn't hoping to come under those circumstances in stocks and bonds. But he came to them nonetheless. And guess what? As soon as he came, they're like, hey, this guy practices what he preaches. man, let's get out there, let's preach. We're a fan of Paul. We want to, he can't get out there. We're going to get out there on his behalf. It was a beautiful thing. They were the generous. The generous would be, I think, kind of like our partnership that we enjoy together in the gospel. Faith Bible and Compass. There's no competition or rivalry there. It's like, hey, you guys are reaching people over there. You're reaching people over here. It's great. It's good. We understand the generous, but what really blows our minds when we're reading a text like this and almost makes it unreal are the jealous. Because you're like, are these guys, are they false teachers? Well, no, they're not false teachers. He says that they're advancing the gospel. Paul here is not talking about false teaching. He does plenty of talking about that everywhere else. Like the way R. Kent Hughes said it, I think is good. He says they weren't anti-Christ, they were anti-Paul. They weren't anti-Christ, they were anti-Paul. So how would that happen? Hang with me a moment. I'm going to do a historical reconstruction for you, okay? So if we imagine what's going on here, the church at Rome at this time is somewhere around 30 years old. They've been around for 30 years. That's a long time for a church. So they're about 30 years old, and we remember that it began primarily as a Jewish group of people. They came from Pentecost, and Jews have pretty strong culture. But inevitably, these Jews would preach the gospel, and Gentiles would be included into the congregation. And so you had kind of a church that was mostly Jewish with a few Gentiles, but something really strange happened around AD 50. This guy named Claudius becomes emperor. He gets really frustrated with all the Jews, and he expels all the Jews from Rome. Well, what does that do to the Roman church? It leaves it with just a few Gentiles. And guess what? They've got to grow up fast. So in the Jews' absence, the actual Gentiles are becoming the prominent leaders within the church, and the church is becoming predominantly Gentile. But Claudius lifts his edict. The Jews came back, and they thought that they were the leaders, and now the Gentiles think they are the leaders, which gives you, by the way, a little bit of context as to why Paul wrote Romans 14 and 15 about Christian liberty and people getting along with one another. But now I want you to think about what this would do for the Apostle Paul. He finally comes into town. These guys are conflicted with one another. And what was his title? The Apostle of the Gentiles. They're thinking, in this little spirit of rivalry that's already there, he's on their team. He's going to help the Gentile cause for Christ. We need to protect our cause for Christ. We need to be reaching more people. And so by the very fact that Paul shows back up in Rome and starts preaching the gospel, they're like, we don't want the Gentile crowd to get bigger than our crowd, so we better be preaching the gospel too. Now, I'm speaking totally historically, but can you just think in modern parlance for a moment, how that would go down? Oh, I don't want that church over there to get bigger than our church. We better get on it. We better get on mission. We don't want that denomination to get bigger than our denomination. We better get on it. We better get on mission. This is exactly what Paul is talking about. Stuff that we think is so unique to our own day has been around for 2,000 years. And so Paul is saying, hey, look, what was supposed to be cooperation had actually become competition. And it's interesting when you look in your text, it says that they were doing this even to afflict him in his imprisonment. They're actually trying to hurt. It isn't just about reaching others. They just want to win the game. Have you ever had anybody do anything just to spite you? Have you ever had anyone challenge you for superiority? Just a couple months ago, I was driving on Immokalee underneath Interstate 75, and I hear this tick-tick in the engine, and then immediately my car locks down. The engine locked up. I don't know what happened. But thankfully, it was under warranty. And so I have it towed into the place, and we're negotiating on how long this thing's going to take. And they're like, it's going to be a couple weeks. You just better settle in. And so they're like, we're going to get you a rental car. I'm like, oh, great. They're paying for the rental car. And I was nice to the guy, and he saw my size and stature, and he's like, we normally put people in this little vehicle. He says, I want to try to get you in something a little more comfortable. I'm going to look for a bigger car. Anyway, they didn't have one. He's like, dude, I'm sorry. He said, the only other thing we have is a Dodge Charger Hemi. Are you okay with that? I'm like, I'll make it work. So for 2 weeks, I get to drive around Naples in this Charger, and it was a pretty fun experience. My neighbors didn't enjoy it because they could hear me pull up every time. Like in the morning when I left and when I came out, it was pretty obnoxious. My kids loved it. My wife hated it. It was, there were all kinds of conflicts. But I really enjoyed the experience because I normally drive a Hyundai Sonata. You're not going to take anybody off a light with a Sonata. But the fact that I now had this car gave me some new possibilities. But I could never find the right moment. And so it happened one day that I was pulling out of Mercado. I'd met somebody for coffee. And I'm sitting there at the stoplight. And this Camaro pulls up beside me. And it was the strangest thing because not a word was exchanged. It was just a look. I mean, it was just a glance. And I knew it was on. I put the thing into sport mode. He revs his motor. I mean, it was just amazing, the way this thing went down. And so we both take off the light. It's pretty neck and neck. And then some older lady in a minivan is in front of me, and there was no way that I could get around her without passing in the grass. And anyway, the guy blows by me. I mean, it was a humiliating experience. But what I wanted to reference is just how subtle, how easy it is for that competition just to go from nothing to everything. You ever see that look? You ever see it in things that matter? Even in church. I mean, is it possible that sometimes we can exchange those competitive glances in ministry? Like, hey, I went to more stuff than you did. Or I volunteer more than you do. I've spent more time here. I've put in more credit. Or you don't know how much our church is doing here. We have to set up and tear down. What about your church? What do you guys do? I mean, it can all of a sudden, what was supposed to be a thing of cooperation can easily become a matter of competition. I wanted to show you a picture of the car. That is not a car. That is actually a Charger Hellcat. I did not have that. I wish I had that. I would have passed the guy in the grass if that would have been the case. But what I would ask in this is what's Paul saying here? Even though those guys are trying to be competitive, even though they're trying to spite me, what then? Look at verse 18. What then? Who cares? Who gives a rip? As long as Christ's name is advanced. In this I will rejoice. Yes, and I will rejoice. I don't care. It doesn't matter. Paul's measuring the right things. Personal prominence means nothing compared to gospel advance. Say, are church people ever tempted to measure prominence? Say, no, Christians. Friends, I just want to be really transparent with you for a moment. I know I didn't introduce myself very well, but maybe this will give you enough. I've seen this spirit of competition in Christendom for a very long time. And I'm not even just going to point to others. Let me just tell you a little bit about myself. Grew up in a Christian home, heard the gospel at an early age. I went to a Christian school. I went to Bible college. I've been to seminary, and I've been pastoring now for a long time, but only 5 years as a senior pastor. In every one of those stages of my development, having been in Christ since a child, I believe, I've seen expressions of this competitiveness. The first time that I can recall this competition and ambition felt toward another was with this kid in school when I was in the 8th grade, and the principal asked him to lead a devotional in chapel instead of me. And I remember thinking, I don't know why they asked him to do that. Then there was that time when I was in the youth group, and for some asinine reason, the youth pastor had a competition as to who was the most spiritual by you got points for bringing your Bible to church and for, who went to the most services. And I remember trying to beat the pastor's son. It was me and the pastor's son. I wanted to win that trophy at the end of the year. I mean, really, I was competing with him. I was kind of happy when he forgot to bring his Bible because, that was more points for me. There were, by the way, no humility trophies in that particular youth group. I felt it again. You think I'd grow out of it. You're like, you know what, you're just a kid. You're just competitive. Well, then I went to Bible college, and it's a long story, but the Bible college I went to was very big on evangelism, and they tracked it. And you had to fill out a report every week of how many people you would share the gospel with, how many people had supposedly prayed and been baptized and all that kind of thing. And guess what? I would fill out that report, and I would put it in the little thing. And then every once in a while, I'd look and see through the other reports to see how many other people were like sharing the gospel too, like how I was stacking up against them. I'm like, Justin, that's Bible college. You were, still 18, 19, 20. Surely you grow out of that at some point. You would think so. But then I would transition to a youth ministry as an associate pastor. And then it became all about how many kids I had at my last youth activity versus how many kids showed up to the other guy's last youth activity. Or how many kids we sent off to our special little Bible college versus how many the other youth groups sent off to their special little Bible college. Then I end up in seminary. You would think seminary is just like, no, this is for mature pastors. These guys are going into the ministry. But the funny thing about seminary, they assess your success on the basis of a number. It's a 0 to 4. It's called a GPA. And then all of a sudden, you're worried about your GPA and how it stacks up versus another person's GPA, when the entire time it's just everybody's supposed to be cooperating together to prepare for ministry. And you're like, all right, Justin, that's seminary. Maybe when you get into pastoral ministry, that's going to fix it. And it doesn't. Because there are times when you look around and you see, oh, well, this church grew by that much. And it seems like they had this many conversions or they had that many views. And this competition, the spirit of personal ambition can haunt you and follow you wherever you go. Now, lest you think that all preachers are charlatans, I want to assure you that didn't characterize my life through all those times. They were just moments. They were flashes at a stoplight of competition. But they're there. They at least were there for me. And all I'm telling you this is to try to actually point out that this spirit of competition actually exists. And I even smell it not just among pastors, but I can smell it among people. It's a fragrance, by the way, I've been wearing for a really long time. And so I smell it in people in church when they seem overly eager to be in the public spotlight. And I smell it when someone seems overly concerned about someone else being in the spotlight. I smell it when someone volunteers for everything to the neglect of other priorities. But I also smell it when someone volunteers for nothing because they're trying to protect their own priorities. I smell it sometimes when someone withdraws from the public gathering because no one talked to them. And I smell it when some people are at every potential event in the public gathering because everybody talks to them. I smell it when someone connives to be part of certain groups. To borrow from Hamilton, they want to be in the room where it happens. But I also smell it when others are complaining that they're not in certain groups. They weren't invited to be in the room where it happened. Friends, I'm not trying to rebuke any ambition or selfishness. I mean, it's an implicit rebuke. But Philippians 2 will help you with that. All I'm trying to say, and that I smell this sometimes, is that it's there. It's real. It happens. It happens in churches. Internally, it happens with churches and other churches. It can happen with denominations or educational institutions or parachurch ministries. So here's what I'm trying to tell you. That spirit of competitiveness is out there. You're going to feel it. And in light of that, what Paul is trying to model is that you better measure what really matters. And your personal prominence and my personal prominence is not it. The advance of the gospel. That's it. So when you feel that impingement, when you're concerned that other people are getting more spotlight, when other people seem to be making more progress, you just need to ask yourself the real question, how am I doing or how are we doing at seeing the name of Jesus advance, not our own name? Not our own name. That's something you can truly find joy in. That's something that will stem that selfishness. I joked around with our elders the other day. I said, I think I'm going to make a new rule. Anytime somebody in my church wants to complain to me about another church member, they first have to fill out a report saying all the ways those people are advancing the gospel. And after they do that, then I'll listen to their complaint. Because it seems like most people forget that, oh, these are co-laborers too. They're trying to preach Christ as well. And so we must measure what really matters. You know, this is a tricky thing. It happens in all realms of life. I read a vivid illustration of this from business. Not spiritual, just I want you to think about just one moment as we bring this to a close about how this can happen. I think it was 1969, 68. Ford Motor Company struggling, big time. Foreign manufacturers are kind of like taking over the market. They've got all these new, cheap cars, and Ford couldn't keep up. And so Lee Iacocca, many of you would know him, of CEO fame, makes a rather gamble of a decision to say, you know what, we're going to have a new measurement. We're going to have a new stat for success. We want a new car made within 2 years that's going to weigh under 2,000 pounds and cost less than $2,000. He said the new measurement is going to be cheap, and it's going to be quantity over quality. And so the whole company realigns around the distributing of this new vehicle that was supposed to revolutionize the market. And it would be the 1970 Ford Pinto. Yeah, you're laughing, and you know why. Not only was it a cheap car, to put it nicely, but it was a dangerous car because they skipped all kinds of safety checks to get this thing on the market as soon as possible. One of the biggest was actually the fuel tank. There was only 10 inches of crush space between the rear axle and where the fuel tank was, causing like basically any high-level rear ending to potentially lead to an explosion. People debate the numbers, but it's somewhere between 50 to 150 Americans died because of their shoddy workmanship. Not only did it ruin Ford financially, but it ruined their name for years. Why? Because they measured what didn't really matter. Friends, that's just temporal. That's just business. But what about the eternal? What about the church? What about our own souls? What are we looking at to pat ourselves on the back and say, you know, it's okay. Things are good. As long as this is happening, I'm okay. What are those things? Well, I think we'd be tempted to measure a few things. One of the things that we're tempted to measure is personal convenience. You need to ask yourself, do you measure good in terms of personal convenience? If I were to ask you right now, hey, how's your week going? And you say good, are you answering that on the basis of the fact that stuff went the way that you wanted it to go this week? If that is the case, you may be, friend, measuring the wrong thing. Because it might actually be hardship from on high that would be the best thing for you. Personal convenience isn't what matters most. Some people are not only tempted to measure personal convenience, but some people like to measure good in terms of personal prominence. Do you measure good in terms of personal prominence? Hey, you know what? As long as my name's out there, as long as people think good of me, you know, I'm good. I mean, should we be able to say that all is well when popularity is up? Friends, this would be especially tempting for you or for me, not only as an individual, but as a church. Because you may look around and you think, oh, well, there's not as many people here as there were before COVID, and so we must not be doing as well. Is that really what we're measuring? Is that supposed to be what we're looking at? Or could we ask ourselves something different? Do we measure something else instead? And so here's maybe the last thing that we could consider. Do we measure good then in terms of gospel advance? I think now we're in the right territory. Because we should be able to say that all is well if Christ's name is advancing. Look, it may be hard on me, but if it's good for the gospel, so be it. Send it, Lord Jesus. You know, I may not be popular, we may not be popular, but Christ is popular among us. People are hearing about Him through us, and that is what matters most. That is exactly the mindset that Paul is calling for in this. Friends, my question for you individually, and then I want you to think about this as your church. Are you measuring what matters individually? Are you advancing the gospel? And then here's the 3 little modifiers that I would use to help you assess this well. Are you advancing the gospel consistently, intentionally, and proactively? Consistently, intentionally, and proactively. I'm not asking you if you led 15 people to Jesus last year. I'm not asking you how many tracts you passed out. I'm just asking if you've been consistent, intentional, and proactive. Think of the alternative. The alternative would be inconsistent, unintentional, and reactive. Oh, if it happens, it happens. Friends, that is not advancing the gospel. That's stumbling into it. What we need to be doing is actually thinking consistently, intentionally, and proactively about personally sharing with others about the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ for sinners. It can happen in the context of our home. It can happen in our relationships. It can happen with strangers. I'm not trying to confine it to anything, but there better be consistent gospel advance. That's what matters. And then lastly, think of this from a church level. So many things we could measure. But can you assure yourselves on this? Christ is preached in this place. When we gather, our pastor faithfully proclaims the word. It goes out in this gym. It goes out online. We as a church are regularly partnering together with others who are doing this. We are consistently, intentionally, and proactively advancing the gospel. If that's a yes, hey, on the authority of Philippians 1, let me tell you, it's all good. It's all good. So, let us measure what matters. Let me pray for us. Father in heaven, your word is so clear. There's no doubt in our hearts and minds after we walk away from a text like this of what really matters. Or forgive us for those times that we've measured good in terms of personal prominence. Forgive us for those times that we've measured good in terms of personal convenience. And now enable us, O Lord, to measure good, to measure progress in terms of consistent, intentional, and proactive gospel advance. I pray that the name of Jesus would be lifted high in our lives individually and in the lives of us as churches, whether it be this church or our church or other churches down the street. Lord, keep the focus of your people on your Son, our King and Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. And it's in His name we pray. Amen.